Hello and welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for this inaugural Care Visions professional talk. It's a series of conversations we're going to be having with experts where we will explore different elements of social work and social care. This evening, we're going to look at children's well-being and development. People who have experienced adversity in their early years can often struggle to cope with their day-to-day lives. How can we best work to help them? This is a challenge not just for professionals, but probably for most families anywhere in the world. It's a huge topic, and we are lucky to have with us Dr. Laura Steckley from the University of Strathclyde School of Social Work and Social Policy, who leads the Master of Science in Advanced Residential Childcare. Laura, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Humphrey. It's nice to be able to come and talk about this very important topic that I'm very passionate about tonight.
Well, we like a bit of passion. We really do. But before we get to the core of our conversation, that maybe that professional bit, I think most of us want to know who we're talking to, not just a name and a title, but the beating heart and soul within. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Why did you pick this line of work? And was it because of your own childhood?
Um, yes, well, like most people, I stumbled into residential childcare by accident. I didn't even know it existed, and it was in the form of residential treatment in Colorado, where I grew up. And I thought I was going to go on to law school in the United States. You do 4 years undergrad and then 3 years of law school. And between those sets of years, I knew I needed to grow up a bit and become more adult. So somebody who had graduated ahead of me had said, "Oh, I'm working in this residential treatment center." So I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. Looking back, I realized that the challenges that I faced as a child growing up were mitigated by important adults in my life, teachers especially, but others in my travels. And I think that experience of realizing how significant a difference key adults can make in your life really probably shaped why I didn't end up going into law school. The world didn't
And
need another lawyer, and why I swallowed the hook, I think of.
give us an example of something in your childhood that you sort of pin on, that you realize made that difference to you?
Um, my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Mitchell, I can tell you the names of all of my teachers from primary school, and most of them from secondary school, and coming to realize that a lot of kids didn't have that kind of experience with their teachers, but Mrs. Mitchell was, was this teacher who really cared. A lot of them did, but she especially about our whole development and our, um not just whether we learned the subjects that she taught, and really helped build us up to feel good about ourselves, but also to be concerned about other people. And she just created a really important kind of safe haven or culture within the classroom that probably then I unconsciously tried to replicate when I was working in residential childcare,
Okay,
and
but
especially early years.
you didn't have a traumatic childhood, I mean, that matched some of the people that we're gonna be or some of the sort of areas we're gonna be discussing?
Probably not to the same degree, but my family definitely had challenges that threatened my healthy development as an individual. So I didn't have an idyllic childhood, but I definitely had more stability and less adversity than the typical kids that end up in residential
Okay,
childcare,
but
for
but but
sure.
enough to make you realize what were the topics that we're gonna be discussing. Now, if any of our
Yeah.
audience have got any questions or comments for Laura, you put them in the chat, just write down a line or 2 lines there, and I will feed it into the conversation as we go along. We're not gonna have a formal Q&A session. This is an informal conversation. Um, you cut your teeth, if that's the right word, in this profession in Colorado, in the United States, and you had a teacher that showed you what was needed for that, and then you moved to Scotland. Why did you move to Scotland, and what difference did you find in your profession there?
Mm. I moved for a couple of reasons. One was personal and a relationship that I followed over. Um, but professionally, this thing called managed care was sweeping the United States, which was a business approach to social care and to the care of adolescents, and again, what was called residential treatment. I think we're about to talk about that, but it just kind of applying business logic to more quickly fixing children and young people and sending them right back into the circumstances that caused the adversities in the first place without any attending to family or wider social issues. And I had the sense that Scotland would be a better place to do this kind of work. And so yeah, for both of those reasons, personal and professional, I came across and started working in residential childcare, which was different and the same all at the same time, which was really confusing and took a lot of unpicking to kind of get a sense of that.
If we take the culture of your teacher that you recognized gave you this holistic outlook on life and how to do things, and then you moved to Scotland. Was the American system, the culture, better or worse? Or I mean, you say it was different. Can
Mm.
you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that teacher I had was when I was like 11, 12 years old, and it definitely was a formative experience like many of my experiences of education. But in residential treatment, which I started working in when I was probably in my early 20s, um, yeah, the culture was around fixing children, and kind of applying um, instruments or methods to help create change. And we wanted to do that with children. We wanted to be empowering to children, but we really had a very limited view about that. At the same time, we were more engaging more with theoretical kind of strands that helped us make sense of what we were seeing and experiencing. So there were some things that were better and some things that were definitely worse. And when I
The,
came
the
sorry.
theoretical was what you went through in the United States. Was that right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Now,
there was more theoretical input or more you could call it lenses, like when you look through rose-tinted glasses, it affects what you see, right? Um,
yeah.
and so the kind of concepts or theories that helped us make sense of things where we there was um, a greater willingness to engage in conversations and to read together and to figure it out. Not that residential treatment practitioners necessarily came in with a dedicated degree of any kind. A lot of them were graduates with like a psychology degree,
Okay.
which didn't equip them that well, but did predispose them to be willing to try to make sense of sometimes the very confounding experiences that happen when you're working with kids who've experienced a lot of
And
pain, you
and
know?
and you wrote a fairly damning piece, if that's the right word, about your view or comparisons in Scotland and the United Kingdom about this dealing with theories, looking at
Mhm.
perspectives. You talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations, a seam of anti-intellectualism that runs through not just Scotland but the United Kingdom in childcare.
Mm.
What we're talking about, what does that mean?
Yeah. So actually, I think I was critical of both sides of the Atlantic, but also talking about it's a mixed bag, and so critical of the things that we could do better to do right by kids and, trying to honor the things that we were doing well. But the soft bigotry of low expectations, I wish I had coined that phrase. I think it's, an excellent way to kind of address what I was experiencing at that time, and mind you, this was, like, 1999 when I moved over and was first working in residential childcare, but, kind of this very low expectations for what children and young people, in our care could achieve or could become, um, and maybe low expectations of ourselves for the degree of um, change together that we could create with them. And so, yeah, that's a phrase that is actually was is used to minimize the impact of wider social structures and their tendency to be ignored in terms of things like poverty, exclusion, stigma, and how that really limits people's ability to get ahead
And
in life. And so, and I
the
did
and
write about that too, but for me, it was also just this very limited view of what children could do. I think I should add, though, to be fair, I think that practitioners in Scotland, and I use this word practitioners because the practice of care, and this piece is really about the practice of care, really high quality care is complex and it requires us to engage our intellect. And it is an advanced practice to be able to do this well. And intellect, not meaning like, black polo neck, you know, university professor intellect. I mean, like applying our thinking to figure out what it is that's going on and that children and young people need. And so,
because
um,
you've written fascinatingly, we're about to come to it, about the various theories that you have talked about here. But has that changed in the past 25 years? You said that you came upon it in 1999, and you talk about people seem to pull down the shutters. They just don't want to know about this stuff. Has that changed? Have you smashed those barriers, Laura?
Oh, I wish I wish I could claim something like that. No, and maybe smashing wouldn't be the right thing either. I think there's always been exceptions, and people tend to find other like-minded people, which I was able to do pretty quickly. But by and large, I could tell that I was probably putting people off with wanting to have these deeper conversations. That said, there's always been people um, who want to take a deeper approach, and that I think that strand of the care sector has grown, and certainly within a couple of years of me moving over, there was a minimum qualification set. I feel that minimum qualification was too low and not the right qualification, um, or maybe just not the right qualification to properly support people in the thinking and the skills that they need for the work, but I think there has grown. The other thing is that I ended up shifting to work at the University of Strathclyde, and so I am in a different bubble, so I haven't smashed anything, but I've had the privilege really of being in a space with people who are really invested in thinking deeply about children and young people and what they need and what their experiences are and what their world is like, in the teaching that I do and the research that I do, and so
So I want to go to these, explore more these theories and this pushing forward. But I want to explore it through something that you wrote to, I think, ground us in where we are. As this, you say, home is the place where we should feel safe. It should be a harbor from the choppy seas of life where we can truly be ourselves. But the children who we care for often come to us filled with fear.
Mm.
Is this the prevalent situation when you talk about child residential care, or is this the prevalent situation where the family, which we all think is the sanctuary, is actually the place where that child must not be?
often. I Before we go into that, I should say that what you just read from is a book that I co-authored with Ruth Emond and Autumn Roche Marsh. And so, like, those actual words, I think might have been Ruth's. Like, we wrote different bits and then shared and everything. So, like, just to have like integrity and yeah, about that. But yeah, together
Uh,
it is our book, and definitely that is one of the key messages. That said, like, we all experience pain from our families, right? Like, very few people have an idyllic childhood and idyllic family lives, and the people closest to us often hurt us the most. And I guess I say that because I don't want us to think of children in residential childcare as like a um completely different entity. They have special needs, but they also have ordinary experiences and ordinary needs alongside of that. But we do need to think about, um, well, children, young people in residential childcare often come there because they aren't safe in their homes, and their families often aren't safe in their communities. or are unable to meet the needs of their parents are unable to meet the needs of their children due to a host of factors, not just inadequacies in the parents. And that's a big shift from the way that we thought about things when I was working in Colorado in the 90s.
Okay.
So,
We've got a few questions in which I'll come to later, because I want you firstly to explain to us what you mean by developmental theory, because this is one of the things you've written about. You have some questions there. How can developmental theory help me know myself better? Why is it developmental theory important for caring? Just expand on all that for us and take us into this world of developmental theory.
okay. Um, it's a broad strand of psychology, developmental theory, that, and even before developmental theory sort of came into prominence, like thousands of years ago, which philosophers preceded science, were interested in like, why do we develop the way that we do? Why do some children grow into adults who have very different lives than others, even though their circumstances might look the same? And so developmental theory, there are many strands of developmental theory that try to understand how we develop physically, how we develop our identities, how we develop our capacity to be in relationships, and how we develop from the impact of relationships. Um, so,
So can I ask you one of the questions that you
sure.
asked us in your
And the,
writing? I mean, and
yes,
let us take the scenario that we're in residential care. The child has got a broken family for whatever reason is there, uh, and and he has professional care staff, he or she has a professional taking them forward, maybe for many years, the most formative stages of their lives. The question that you ask, what are some of the important concepts that can help me understand a child's development? What are they, Laura?
okay. Well, maybe we'll just start with one of the most prominent ones, so it might be familiar to people listening, and it's a good way um, to to start. So, how we experience relationship as children and young people, or as infants, affects then that child's view of you as an adult caring for them, and probably the most prominent um, lens through which we make sense of that is attachment theory. Attachment theory's got its limitations, and it can definitely be misused, so I have to give a proviso, but I think any theory has its limitations and can and often is misused. So, but really beginning to, and you mentioned the question of, like, how can theory help me know myself? One of
Yes.
the things attachment theory helps us do is be curious about, uh, children's inner experiences and view of the world, and how their experiences shape their, so something very accessible is like, if you in your very early years experience the world as an untrustworthy place, adults were not going to be available to meet your needs. You were left to fend for yourself in dirty nappy or empty stomach, that sort of thing. Then your sense of the adults, if you're then in residential childcare, your sense of their trustworthiness, their ability to meet your needs is going to be influenced by those early experiences. Now, that doesn't mean that it's set in stone forever, no more, but it does mean that it's going to take more than people just saying, you can trust us, for a person to be able to trust. And that's all of us. That's not just kids in residential childcare. We're all shaped by formative experiences and then by important, significant ex relationships then that are subsequent to that, and so
I'm going to break my own schedule with this, because you've mentioned
okay.
something there that has piqued my curiosity,
Alright.
and then I'm going to go back because you have, I'm not sure which of your many published works this was in, but you talk about the adult not actually being matching the developmental response of the child. So you talk about expectations both of her behavior and her ability to respond to his attempts to reason with her. So
Yeah.
you're trying to reason with a child on something and it's just not hitting through. I mean, this is a very sensitive bit of childcare, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I mean, that's why residential childcare workers need some of the basics of developmental theory, but that I'll talk you through that very briefly, and that I did write that bit because I did actually witness this father and his toddler daughter in a garden center, and she's at that age where she just like it's her developmental kind of job, if you will, to like get her hands into everything and put things in her mouth and so she's wanting to touch everything and he's trying to buy bedding plants or whatever he was buying, but he keeps, trying to get her not to touch stuff, right? And he keeps squatting down, and he's trying to be a good dad, like, it was really clear, and he's, like, trying to reason with her and explain to her why she can't be touching everything and why she, needs to do what he's saying, and, but her attention span is too short, and her impulse control, but also, like, her need to explore her world, like, so he's trying to be a good dad, but he's like his expectation of her attention span and her ability to follow his logic just didn't match where she was, and that little bit and then so generally speaking, understanding where people are developmentally, but then understanding the impacts of adversity, trauma, abuse, neglect, and how that affects a person's development. So you may have a 14-year-old laddie with, in front of you who developmentally his capacity, say, to manage a bit of disappointment is much less developed. But if your expectations for him are at a level of a typical 14-year-old's ability to handle what you might think is a really small amount of disappointment, then you could see how that mismatch
Yes.
comes into
Yeah,
to
so
play.
it's important. So this is a high degree. I mean, on the one level, it's a high degree of parenting skills, but if there are no parents around, it's a much higher degree of care, psychology, whatever you want to call it. There's another question that you asked that which struck me because I put it in bold here. How do I know whether behavior is part of normal development or something else? This particularly, we have so many people or children now with certain disorders that are being diagnosed. Uh, how do we know whether the child's just naughty or whether there's something something else going on there?
Yeah, and there's no easy formula, but I think being able to kinda have some sense of, like, terrible twos, most people know about terrible twos, and if you learn a bit of developmental theory, you understand that the terrible twos could be understood as, beginning to have a sense of agency in the world and the ability to influence, and that's important developmentally, and so rather than it's just your two-year-old being terrible. It's this child needing it's all children needing to learn that and needing to have experiences of agency, of being able to influence their world and influence the outcome of things. And
Mm.
if you are working with a 14-year-old who's still struggling to have a healthy sense of agency in the world, then, you might think, well, in some respects, this may not be typical, although I think teenagers go through a second version of the terrible twos, don't they? Um, eh, I
Yeah.
there's 2 things going on here that I think are important. One is that we're not quick to pathologize or make it into, like, a deficit or a problem, but also to have expectations that this child may struggle with managing disappointment or managing competition as a result of not having enough opportunities to develop those things through school exclusion or what have you. So that again, we're trying to have our expectations match where children are, not to leave us in that soft bigotry of low expectations, but to meet children where they are at, to support them to develop into where they can become. If our expectations are constantly too low or too high,
Mm.
then we'll struggle to actually meet them where they're at to support them to where they need to go.
So in the no, no. First, is it the case that in a way every child is different and unique, but every child should be the same in that they walk at such and such an age, they talk at such and such, they read at such and such an age, and they sort of grow these age benchmarks that are given. Um, is that an accurate description, or is every child really different, and we should not be more aware of how to spot that?
Mm. There's a bit of both and there. So in some ways, like knowing what the typical course, especially with certain milestones, it's useful to know that maybe that child needs a bit of extra support.
Mm,
And in other respects, like I mentioned attachment theory and kind of people's internal working models about like how relationships work and how trustworthy other people are, then that's more tailored, but there's still patterns that help us understand. So for example, if you grew up in a household where you had to exaggerate your needs in order to get noticed, then you're going to have, not even at a conscious level, you're going to have a sense that it's only when it's this big dramatic horrible thing happening that somebody's going to take notice of me and and give me what I need, give me attention, for example. Then even that's less stage development. At a certain age this happens, like your question, but we can learn from understanding the bigger picture, but then tailor that for understanding what's going on for that child, not in a way of they're in deficit, but more in a way of what added supports they need, what added understanding do we need to apply here.
and if a child, say 5, 7, it comes to you or to residential care from a highly traumatic family where there's been drugs and drink and violence and that sort of thing. What are the measures that have to be understood there against a child that's come from a fairly normal background as far as development goes?
Mm. Well, the whole range, although it- as residential childcare workers, we are less equipped and maybe less focused on measures you mentioned or psychometric testing or that sort of thing, and more it's more an art of the relationship, an art of utilizing the home environment and the developmental opportunities with some understanding of the science behind like what how for example, if you grew up in the kind of environment that you've just described, Humphrey, that's highly traumatized, understanding say some of the neurobiological effects that that has, and in the years that I've been working at the university, that's been an area that's just burgeoning. Similar proviso, it could be misused and is misused, but it also has explanatory power for us to understand things like hypervigilance. Like if you grew up in an environment where you had to be super vigilant to make sure that you could protect yourself against violence. Just because you're in a different environment doesn't mean that your nervous system immediately calms down and you know that you're safe. You'll have the experience of not being safe, even if all of the signals in the environment are, especially if you're separated from your family, that in itself is going to feel unsafe at first. So, like, yeah, um, there's less about measures and being able to apply a formula, and it's more about understanding concepts and beginning to identify, yeah, this child shows.
And is there a I don't know what you call it, a formula, a system, a way to get that child so that the trauma that they've had in their childhood doesn't impact on them throughout their lives, so that they're constantly resenting it or blaming it or whatever it is, so that they can move on?
So both ends, like I do use the term restorative for restorative care, and I do sometimes use the term healing, but the for any of us that have experienced significant wounds, like they don't just go away. And so it's more about being able to accommodate them. So on the one hand, thinking we can just fix things is, I think, dangerous. On the other hand, thinking, "Oh, well, that child will, forever, be damaged by that," I think is also pretty dangerous. Human beings are extremely adaptable, and so being able to adapt and accommodate that, make sense of that, but to, develop beyond that, I think is maybe a way of thinking about what we're aiming for, and children do have the capacity to um, develop into amazing, well, they already come to us pretty resilient that they've survived what they've survived, but to develop into amazing young adults. And I've seen
Yeah.
so many of them able to do that. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of both and we can't take it
And
away, but we can't
yeah.
yeah, we
And,
can't expect that it's going to define their lives.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I was thinking of the American Vice President J.D. Vance, who had an alcoholic, drug-ridden mother and grew up in absolute poverty, and something there has made him into what is in. He's only 40 years old, so so we've got some interesting questions in which I'll just go through in order. They take us back. A lot of it takes us back to America. Alan MacDonald, I'm aware ACES originated in America. Does this influence your work?
Uh, ACEs,
What
ACEs
is
are
it?
yeah, they're an attempt to kind of ACEs come from big data, and big data is like looking at very large populations of people and those that have had these adverse childhood experiences, which are what ACEs stand for, like how that then influences the outcome. And so, the more ACEs that you have, the more likely that you may have certain adversities into your adulthood and certain health issues. And in some respects, it's really interesting, and it confirms some of what we already knew that early adversities, especially if they're not addressed, plague people into their adulthood. On the other hand, they come from big data, and your question about like every person is an individual also needs to be held on to. So I think ACEs should just be one small part of the overall way we try to make sense of what's happened to children and young
Does it
people.
influence your work, Laura?
Minimally, minimally.
Minimally,
Yeah,
minimally. It does not.
minimally. I know about ACEs, I think they're interesting, but I don't reach for them in making sense of things or in theorizing about things.
We have a parallel question from Kayphone. Which theories and frameworks do you think are comparably positive here and in the USA to underpin excellent practice?
Oh, that's a good
It
question.
is a good question, isn't it? Mm.
Well, my big and anybody in the room who knows me, will be chuckling now because I've made it 32 minutes without talking about containment theory, but, that containment theory is much more prevalent in the UK, much less so in the United States, although it's making inroads. And I think, at least from a residential childcare perspective, I think containment theory, alongside attachment theory, which is prevalent on both sides of the Atlantic, I think handled carefully and with requisite understanding and depth of understanding, I think both have um, great explanatory potential, not just for understanding what children and young people need and how to meet those needs, but also what adults need in order to meet the needs of children and young people. So I would say those two. And the book that Humphrey had read from, there is a chapter on containment in that book that would be maybe a place to start if you're interested. So
Okay, I'm going to got one question. Then I have a question going back for you with this one from Schön Schulteis, if I pronounced that correctly. Is it like Erickson's theory? Children may be of physical age, but might be struggling with some of the tasks, virtues they didn't master when they were young.
yeah, and I think you could any stage development. Erickson is a stage development theorist, and I think that's a really nice question that shows some good understanding that, and for all of us, we don't eh, whether we're looking at Erickson's is a good example though. Like we may not totally master, each of the stages, and things can happen even into our adulthood that kind of throw us into crisis in relation to, say, trust versus mistrust, which is the first stage of Erickson. But generally speaking, if we have good enough care, good enough experiences that we do master enough trust and who to mistrust, then most of the time things going well in our lives, yeah, we build on that with the next stage and the next stage. So that's a really
Okay.
nice question. I think
And
that's
I just want to throw in a sidebar, and then I want to go to Craig's question. My own sidebar is what amongst all these theories creates the can-do theory in the United States that you came up against the seam of anti-intellectualism and the low achievement, the low ambition that you found in the United Kingdom. Is there anything that you can put on?
Yeah, there's 2 things I can mention, and one of the things and why I think people had a hard time having higher expectations for kids in Scotland when I first moved here was an understanding of, like, what was happening at what we might call a macro level, and Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who's one of the most quoted, figures for residential childcare, he's the guy who said every child must have at least one adult who is irrationally crazy about him. Um, but he was a developmental theorist, as it happens, and he encourages us to look at all of the different layers of influence on a child, on a developing child, including things like racism, sexism, poverty, the stuff at the macro level, he would say. And in the United States, like, everybody's a self-made man, like, you just need to pull up your socks and just get on with it, and nobody wants to think about. I say nobody, I'm exaggerating, but certainly in a professional context, we did not think or talk together about macro level kind of influences over what was happening for these children, for our practice, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So being able to hold both is a pretty big demand that we're asking of our residential childcare workers, which is why
Yeah.
we need a better qualifying, um, bar to support their their
Yes, and that's a whole, I mean, a whole area that I'm not sure we should get into, but let's touch on it,
okay.
is the resources of in the care industry,
Yeah,
generally speaking, and the qualifications that
yeah.
quite often that you go into these places and no one is qualified. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, Scotland had decided to raise the bar for qualification, which, on the one hand, I think was a really bold move in terms of saying, yep, we do accept that this is really complex work, that people need skills and knowledge and professional identity to really support them to do this really demanding, complex work, as I said. Um, and then the independent care review came and that was paused and it hasn't been picked back up. Now, I don't think it's any level 9 qualification, which was what had been decided. I think we as a sector need to say this is what people need. They don't need a field social work qualification to be able to deal with an escalating child in front of them. They need a tailored qualification that actually speaks to the realities of frontline practice that includes developmental theory, for example, in a robust way.
Can I just clarify that what you're saying here is that there is no tailor-made qualification for somebody going into a childcare residential care home that they could either study once they've been taken on or that they have already.
There's an HNC in health and social care. I think the title actually has been changed slightly. Yeah, and I don't remember, but it's more generic than that. Um, uh, s Generic social work degree is accepted as a qualification, but I would say there is one in Scotland that is tailor-made, but it's at master's level. I have the good fortune of being
A
able to.
master's level, but you're not
Yeah.
not gonna get.
And this came on the back of the Edinburgh inquiry into institutional abuse in residential childcare,
Okay.
and part of
Yeah.
the response to that inquiry was, to raise the caliber of leadership and practice in residential childcare. So
But
that
that's
course
that's not
does still
on the
exist.
floor childcare, that's management childcare.
Well, it's
Yeah.
both though. I have students who come that are just not just, there is no just about frontline practice,
Yeah.
like direct care practice, but it's more of the population of the cohorts are in management posts,
Okay. Yeah.
middle and upper management, but we'll take people who have requisite um, lower level qualifications and
Yeah.
experience.
But yes,
So.
but no, this is. I want to bring Craig. Craig's asked a question here. Do you have a view on the current use of high quality reflection at depth as a core developmental tool to support the workforce? High quality reflection. What is that?
Yeah. Um, I wonder if that's my friend Craig. Craig and well, we've been working on a model called Ralph, the Reflection and Action Learning Forum,
Yeah.
primarily focused on in helping people increase their reflective capacity, especially under pressure. Well, the model is not under pressure, but then to see if that translates to those pressurized moments when kids are escalating and their behavior may be becoming an imminent danger to themselves or other people. And yeah, I think the demand to do this job well requires an ability to reflect at depth, and it requires services to develop cultures, and yet I think that support, reflection at depth. And I think it's probably more rare than we'd like to admit. But I think when you think about the very busy spaces that are residential childcare services, how hard it is to create those kind of spaces and support them. So yeah, that's a bit of work on the side.
Okay, that's
Not on the
um
side, but
we
core.
have more questions. I want to go into one of your other headlines that I saw in your work there that needs explanation. Ambiguous loss. What is ambiguous loss?
Yeah, I was interested that you picked up on that. But it kind of fits. So ambiguous loss is a term, again, not coined by me, but well, let's back up and just talk about loss. The kids in residential childcare have experienced profound losses of all different kinds. I and Ambiguous loss, I think, is a useful concept because when you've experienced a loss that isn't really recognized as a loss by your social surround, it can affect your ability to work through that loss. And so, if you have a child coming into residential childcare whose parents have died, there's a much greater recognition for that loss. But just the loss of every single child in residential childcare has lost the ability to live in their family of origin for at least a period of time. And I can only speak for myself, but I think there were times in my practice where I became desensitized to that. Like it was hard to keep in mind what a painful, significant loss that was, exerting influence all the time for these kids. And so, but there are other, losses that are often not recognized or that children will feel ambivalence about. So if you've been removed from an abusive home, part of you might be relieved and part of you might want everything to go to back to normal or go to a place of non-abuse. And so we see children who are experiencing a loss that maybe partly they're relieved and partly they're heartbroken. Um,
Which is why it's ambiguous, because
exactly.
you're not.
Exactly.
And just to clarify in my own mind, if a child comes from that sort of environment to a residential home, the shift workers that are doing the day-to-day shift of care there, would they know what you're talking about on ambiguous loss and the speakers? They're coming here in a state that a child is not normally there. Would they understand that?
I
Would
think residential childcare workers will understand that children have experienced loss for sure.
Okay.
The term ambiguous loss, I don't think is in a high currency at the moment, and I think there is something about having a name for something
Yeah.
that helps us talk
Hmm.
about it.
Yeah. Mm.
But to keep that in mind and keep that present, I think again is a significant demand. And then what do you do with that, and how do we understand the impacts of profound losses on children's development to
And
bring
and
us
and
back?
and you say the shift worker would understand it. Would they be trained to understand it? Would there be things, or would they understand it through experience?
Probably more through experience. I don't know how much loss is in the health and social care agency. I think it's probably quite limited. And then understanding, like, how does that how does that help me understand that child's needs? How does that
Yeah.
help me know how I might respond differently? Again, I don't know how well that application of concepts to practice is happening at most other
Yes. And
qualifications.
and this is where you talk about you need these long-term relationships
Yeah. Yeah.
with the children. Timia has a question here. How have you got any tips? Yes, we like tips. How could we make more parents carers and most importantly schools of ACEs and trauma informed practice? I'm a wellbeing practitioner in a primary school and my room impact is huge, I feel. However, I feel the knowledge of the above are so little. In a
Yeah.
way, that's what I was talking about just now. Yes,
Yeah.
does
I
that
mean,
work?
trauma is trauma I think we can leverage the fact that, people have begun to take on board that trauma does impact development, does impact people's ability to respond, adults' ability to respond, and so, like, again, it can be misused and simplistically applied, but at the same time, Scotland has made, commitments to be a trauma-informed nation. So if that question is coming from Scotland, you can go online and look about that, or even if you're not in Scotland, you can look at Scotland's attempt to lead the way. It's hard not to become tokenistic in that respect, and at the same time, there's a lot of resources out there that helps us talk about that in a more informed way, and people are interested in trauma. So it's we're at a better time than we used to be when people were be like, "Oh, bad things happen. It's no excuse. The child just needs to buck up," you know?
Yeah, and that's so that is shifting a little bit. Leslie Milne, I did a residential childcare social work route with RGU, in which the majority of the course was based on residential childcare. That is a comment, but comment on the comment, Laura.
Yes, I'm I'm thank you, Leslie, for raising that. RGU and University of Strathclyde and, while I was at Strathclyde, both had a residential childcare pathway under the social work degree, and, I do have a high opinion of the work that RGU was doing with that residential childcare pathway. I was very sorry to see that go. And there was a real dedication to some very tailored content that was aimed at the realities of practice in residential childcare. Thank you for bringing that up because
Yeah,
I
it's
didn't include that in my answer before.
and now I want to move on to another phrase that you use and explain it to us: threshold concepts.
Uh, yeah, you had asked about research, and so I'll just be very brief. As an educator, I'm interested in what practitioners need to really grasp some of these concepts and areas of learning and areas of practice to really be able to make that difference in their care of children and young people. So there's a theoretical kind of framework called threshold concepts that are core concepts in any discipline, in this case in residential childcare, child and youth care, but they're more than just core concepts. They have characteristics. I'm not going to give them all to you because we're tight for time. But two very identifiable characteristics are that they're transformative. Once you really get it, it brings your practice to a much higher level. And of course, as an educator, I'm interested in which ones of those and how I might help support that. But the other thing, one of the other most recognizable characteristic is they're troublesome. They're hard to get your head around, or they're seeming in our case, they're seemingly simple when actually they're much more complex and challenging than people initially think or than outsiders to our field think, like relational practice or relationship-based practice. And there's a sense that if you're just good at relationships, that's why you're in the field. And actually understanding what constitutes relational practice is an area we have a lot of work to do. And I guess I'll just use as an example, you've probably worked with one or more people who thought they had really good relational practice, but maybe the way they were in relationships with kids or other staff members gave you a stomach ache, right? So, like, what exactly do we mean by good relational practice? What does that look like? How do we develop that, especially with children and young people who rightly are resistant of getting into relationships because they've been hurt through previous relationships. Like, this is really, really complex work. And so I've been agitating a bit about, yeah, we can talk in the promise or other policy documents about the importance of relationship, but what are we really doing to understand and support the work that frontline practitioners are doing in trying to build relationships that really are tested and really are complex advanced practice to get right.
Can I ask you a completely impossible question that came to me whilst you were saying that? Can you
Okay.
encapsulate for us the difference between, in this relationship thing, parenting,
Yeah.
fostering, and being a shift worker in in a residential care home? I mean, you've
I
got
guess
one.
that's the other it's kind of there's been a historical shift around how we think about that role. And that role has always had an element of parenting to it, but at the same time, the danger is beginning to think that we replaced a child's parents, especially if that child is still going to their family of origin at the weekend, or even if they're not, like, it's another complexity to the relationship. We do parenting, we do raising, upbringing of the child, but at the same time, we aren't their parent, although
Yeah.
and there's been a really interesting piece of work by a colleague who's now in kind of he's retired, but he's still doing work, Andy Kendrick, who talked about, um, relation like family relationships in terms of children and young people often will want to refer to us as their father or their mother or their mother like or and how our idea of what it means to be a professional is a no you and how actually we've been sort of denying some of that reality for children and young people. It's just an added layer of complexity to navigate that while not invalidating the relationship that's there and what that experience is like for that child or young person.
There's a question from Maureen Dimmock which slightly touches on this. Do you think we tend to overanalyze some of our young people's behaviors?
We might, yeah, and I think we also probably underanalyze and just, depending on what, the culture of work that you're in. I think both are happening and both are we're at risk of both. And sometimes kids just need to be allowed to be kids. Other times I think we just dismiss a kid as just being off the rails or whatever without properly attending to what's going on for that child. So, yeah, yes, both sides.
Yes, on both sides. We have a couple of more. I'm going to try and get as many. Alan MacDonald, again, I have a feeling some of our observations have touched on situationism approach. This can be influenced by the social justice traditions in Scotland. Any
Okay.
thoughts, Laura?
I don't know about that, but I do know that our beloved Adrian Ward, who is also retired, but he wrote about opportunity-led work, and I wonder if what he wrote about and what the questioner is wrote about are very similar neighborhoods to each other.
Yes. He adds actually that peer supervision is essential also, and understanding the stages of loss, where the young person is
Yeah.
at, is essential stages of loss.
Yes, for
Was
sure.
yeah,
And rituals around loss and the power of rituals, whether to do with loss or other things, to help children process and accommodate losses and other
yeah,
experiences in their lives. Yeah, I
yeah,
definitely agree.
stages.
And
Paul,
I would add from peer supervision, I think clinical supervision, which is a different kind of supervision than the standard where your supervisor helps you make sense of kind of the impact of the work on you and the deep kind of feelings and complexities in that it's a different kind of supervision that is given to therapists and clinical staff in hospitals, in psychiatric wards, and I think residential childcare should have its own version of something like clinical supervision as well.
okay, so there's a couple of times you sort of mentioned this sort of residential childcare needs its own booklet or needs its own
Yeah.
something that everybody can dip into. Paul says, I've explained to children in the past the reason why they may be feeling or behaving the way that they are. Most children I care for have no idea the way why they are behaving in a certain hold on, my thing's gone. In a certain way, or why they're feeling in a certain way. Would having workshops for children explain some of that attachment containment be useful to them to better understand what's going on in their minds? Are there workshops for children on this?
I have Ruth, who's the lead author of that book that you read those chapters on, Humphrey. She's a play therapist, and she often talks about how children will come in and say, "Yeah, something's wrong with my brain, and that's why I behave the way that I do," or "I've got an attachment disorder. That's why I behave the way that I do." So, like anything, handled well, I think it's helpful for children to have ways of making sense of their experiences, and sometimes if we translate adult information into, something that's age appropriate for those kind of children who are ready to have that kind of insight-oriented work. Some children don't wanna go there. Other children do want to make sense of why, and I think but we have to be careful that we don't offer them simplistic renderings that then they just get reduced to, "I have an attachment disorder," or, "I have ADHD, that's why I behave the way that I do," and nothing can be done.
Okay, Meg Lindsay is an interesting one here. Shift workers, which we've talked to, skilled professional residential childcare workers. The children they care for have all experienced trauma, otherwise they would not be and would not be in residential childcare. Is the intensive care service of children's services? Is that the case? I mean, in the childcare residential services, there are the resources there is the workforce to have all skilled workers on the shift floor, as it were?
It should be the intensive care unit or the critical care unit, but it isn't resourced as such, no.
It's not the
And
case.
care generally in society isn't resourced given its
Yeah,
importance in a well-functioning, flourishing society. You
yeah.
know, it's no coincidence that
Yes. And Scot and S it's resourced better in Scotland than in England and Wales, isn't it?
I think so,
Yeah,
and there's more aspiration for it, more recognition of the complexity of the work than
yeah,
in
yes,
and in many parts of the world as well, other parts
yes.
of the world.
A question from Kay Fern: to have your HNC and SVQ3 are considered fully qualified on the residential pay scale in Scotland, but often I feel these are tokenistic, and that even when some of us have these, it is not used to fruition as an everyday understanding or analysis of presenting behaviors. Do you think all residential workers should be qualified to a degree or higher to deal with the job? I just feel we need to learn so much more, or do you think we can balance it with practical experience? What a good question that we're almost ending with.
Yeah.
Sum us up, Laura.
Well, if I had the magic wand, I think we would have a degree level qualification that is funded by our government, just like all field social workers have a degree level qualification that's funded by the government. Unfortunately, right now, um, it's up to services to qualify their own workforce, and yet it is a higher pressure, um, more intensive work. It is less sociable working hours, and so, yeah, some things don't match up there. I I think practical experience is really valuable and important as well, but I think being able to integrate practical experience with theoretical knowledge and research-based knowledge so that you can make the most of it is really what's necessary for, like, the level of demand of doing good care.
Yeah. It's not, is it just resources and training, or is it, I mean, a lot of the stuff you said is fascinating about the levels of development, the stages of loss, and that sort of
Mhm.
thing that we've discussed. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to half wrap us up, and then I'm going to come back to you to give us a top line thought so that we can all go away and tell everybody what we've discovered out of today's thing. But this is our first Care Visions professional talk hour. It is coming to a close. Unfortunately, because I could have gone on for another hour. We have recorded this, and everyone here will get a link to watch Laura's brilliant explanations and insights. And again, please share that link with friends and colleagues, because childcare and development really, really matters, not just to the profession, but to all of us. All of us have families that are going through this. And you all know that, otherwise you wouldn't be here this morning. We're also going to email you about our future Care Visions professional talks in the coming months. And if there's any area that you would like us to cover, just drop us a line, tell us why, and we'll bring in an expert, or it might be you, to take Laura's place here. Big shoes to fill. Now, Laura, just as we are about to sign us, give us a top line, burn into our memory a parting thought for us.
I'm gonna cheat and do 2 because you kind of opened up, like, why is it and we live in a society that doesn't value care, and so you're working I'm assuming that you're working in care, and I'm assuming in that a significant number of you work or have worked in residential childcare. And so the reality is we work still in a society that doesn't value that. Nevertheless, you probably are making a profound difference in the life of children and young people. So the parting thought is this: we've talked a lot about development, and really, bottom line is that profound influence you're having comes from the everyday, all of the little things, just like the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon, and it was all those little drips of water that makes up the Colorado River. All those little drips of how you wake up a child in the morning, how you let them know that you thought about them on your days off, how you tuck them in at night, how you deal with the crisis, how you repair when you've spoken in a way that you wish you hadn't. All of that, all of that, all of that, all of that. It's all those little things combined that make the difference in supporting that child to develop through to a better place in their lives. And so, I guess I thank you for the work that you did, for taking time up on your Thursday evening to attend and think more about this work, and for doing it.
Excellent. That is a great thought. I'll remember the Colorado River the next time I'm I'm going to use that, and I'm going to steal it from you, Laura. Thank you, Dr. Laura Steckley, for sharing with us what you know. It has been absolutely brilliant. Until next time, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all at Care Visions, thank you for joining us on Professional Talk, and goodbye. Bye. Thanks, Laura. Brilliant.
Good night.
Good night.